I'll get started.
So today what I want to do is look through, well, not look through, but to start with thinking about some foundational principles of Restorationism, especially focused on those that would have been most important to the Restoration movement as it developed in America. Before we get too far in that, I want to remind you that the first reflection essay on Alexander Campbell's Restoration of the Ancient Order of Things, those articles, the first one is due on the 20th of January. That's a Friday, a week from this coming Friday. The assignments are posted in Blackboard, and essentially you have your option of 3 of those articles. You only need to read one, pick one, and get a brief summary of what Campbell's talking about, the kind of evidence he uses, the argument that he's making, and then the second part of the assignment is to kind of evaluate that. Do you agree, disagree? Is this something that should be accepted, something that should be rejected? And of course the why and the why not, the why or why not are a part of that as well. So don't forget to keep that in mind. As I mentioned in the last session, you don't need to do all 5 of those essays. You only need to do 4. So you could, if you prefer, skip this first one. But if you do all 5, you do get some extra points. So I would encourage you to consider doing this first one. And if you have any questions, please get in contact with me about that. So let's talk about some principles that undergird the notion of restoration and what the Restoration movement has historically been, kind of a theological overview to some extent. In many cases, one of the first things to think about is what the term restoration entails. When you think of restoration or the Restoration movement, there are certainly different aspects to think about and different ways that a term can be used. So in talking about restoration in a religious sense, one of the first ways to think about the term would be with the idea of return. Restoration suggests that something has taken place that has moved, in this case a religious group or religious movement, away from the original intent of the founder or God or whatever. We're talking very generic terms at this point. So restoration, of course, suggests that there is a need to go back to the origin, to the first group, to the first principles, to the way in which it was originally established. So in thinking about restoration in terms of a return, the idea would be that there is something that is necessary to be followed, or that the example of the original group, the original founders, is somehow binding on the entirety of people. It's not an idea of this person started this thing and then we can go wherever we want with it. Restoration suggests that there's a mentality of those things that were originally laid out need to be followed. So, in one sense, restoration can be used in the terms of a return, going back to something. We can also think about restoration in the terms of, or understand it in terms of repair. Now, we can see how that would generally be used. If you're going to restore an old painting or restore an old car, there's this idea again of returning to original, but that there are things that have happened to
this object that need to be fixed. And so the same kind of thing would carry over with religion, that restoration suggests things have broken in the religion, or things need to be mended or fixed in a sense. And so restoration can be used in that sense as well. So not just a return, but the idea of something's broken or something needs to be fixed. Restoration can also suggest the idea of recovery. Now, again, in the use of these terms, there's a lot of overlap and semantics and slightly different fields of meaning. But when we think of recovery, we think of the idea of something being lost. Right? So return means to go back, repair means to fix, recover means things have been lost. So restoration in this sense would mean that there is an attempt to bring back or revive or bring to memory, might be another way to think about it. That not only is something broken, things have been lost. And so it's not just a matter of going back, it's not just a matter of fixing something, it is recognizing some things that haven't been done in the context of a religious movement, or fully understanding the picture, the idea.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
What was the second one? You said things that you attempt to bring back, and what was the second one? You said to revive, or
I don't remember exactly what it was. What did I say?
Things that have been lost.
Attempt to be revived.
And then you said the second one, and then the last one, the third point was to bring back some memories.
Revive. That's the word it was. I'm just thinking it right now. I didn't have it in my notes, but like, here we're talking about recovery for a little bit. So the idea of recovery would be another way to think of restoration in terms of religion. And then finally, Blackboard's running slow today. There we go. Renew would be another way to think of restoration. Kind of like repair, although repair would have the ideas of just fixing something. Renew is that idea of returning something to its original pristine shape. That there's something about the original that should be returned, or there's something perfect or exceptional in the original. And so in the context of religion, it would be to recapture what not only the original teachings of the founder, or as we would think in Christianity, the teachings of Jesus, the apostles, but then also kind of the commitment, the spirituality, the intensity, renewing that as well. And so all of these terms are helpful in thinking about restoration. So when you have, in our case, Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone and similar people, these are some of the ideas that they're conveying and calling for restoration. Right? The idea of needing to go back, the idea of something being broken that needs to be repaired, something that needs to be renewed, and then some things that have been lost that need to be recovered. And so, largely when we're talking about a restoration movement, these are the kind of things that we're thinking about. What does it mean to restore? In thinking about particularly this version of restorationism that we're talking about this semester, and thinking about what's being restored, what is it that restorationists are trying to do, especially in those early decades, I think that it's important to understand the view of history that is at work in the restoration movement. Because it is a view of history that is slightly different than other Christians and other groups, other followers of Jesus would say, looking at what is church history about. So it starts off, as you might expect, with the belief that the apostles laid out a pattern that is to be followed by Christians. Now, while there's a recognition by restorationists that some elements of what the apostles did and how the apostles practiced could vary from culture to culture, could vary from time period to time period, the assumption is that there are some things that should be practiced and believed irrespective of culture or historical era. That there are things that are independent of those things that should be followed. So the belief is that God and Jesus had a pattern for salvation, church organization, the life of a Christian that should be replicated in different time periods. And that essentially the role of the apostles was to spread that pattern in the first century Roman world and elsewhere, with the intent that churches were to believe and worship alike. Now, certainly there's a recognition that as you read through the New Testament, these letters to these churches, that they didn't all worship alike. But the response would be by restorationists that part of the reason they're not worshiping right is they are not following the pattern. So that when Paul writes, the response might be, well, which church should we restore? Should it be Corinth? Should it be Rome? Should it be Ephesus? With the assumption that when you look at the letters to Rome, Ephesus, Corinth, that they represent distinctions in worship. Well, the response would be, well, no, they represent, for example, the case of Corinth, where Corinth has gotten it wrong, which is the whole reason why Paul is having to write the letters, that they are doing some things wrong. So the assumption that Paul is making, a restoration would argue, is that there is a pattern that he can appeal to that Corinth, Rome, Ephesus should be following. And what he highlights in his letters are places where either certain things need to be emphasized, certain things need to be corrected, based on the specific instances of that congregation. But the underlying assumption would be that even though we see variance across these churches, there is a pattern that should be followed. Now, it would not take very long. I mean, if you accepted an apostolic pattern, right, that Paul and the other apostles are laying out, this is how it should be done. It would not take long to determine that there's a difference between how that is presented in the New Testament and how we see it depicted in church history or even contemporary society. And in fact, there probably wouldn't be too much argument to say that Christianity as it is practiced in the 21st century is different in a lot of ways from Christianity of the first century. Certainly there's a lot of continuity, and some of that, of course, could be differences in culture, but you have quite a bit of differences across different Christian groups about some of the things about worship and belief. So how would a restorationist conceive of that in terms of thinking about that as a historic what's the view of history that's being presented in a restoration mindset? Well, the assumption would be that while the apostles laid out a pattern, gradually over the first several centuries, churches and Christians moved away in a negative way, right? So gradual falling away, right? And we wouldn't say that they're moving, if the restorationists wouldn't say they're moving away in a positive way. So that after the apostles died, those second, third generation Christians, even to the fourth generation, started adding things that weren't a part of the pattern, started omitting things that were part of the pattern, or modified different things depending upon what you're talking about.
They changed, modified, and added.
Yes, right. So changed, added, and omitted. Yeah, so they added things, they forgot to do things, or they changed some things that were already being done. Now, here there, of course, is a very important theological question. Essentially, what we have here is an assumption that, well, first of all, that there's a pattern, and second of all, that there are distinctions between that pattern and those early centuries, which in itself would be what we might call a Protestant outlook, or an outlook shaped by Protestantism, which rejects the idea of the continuing development of apostolic tradition into the early centuries of Christianity, where Catholics and Orthodox Christians, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, what I mean by that term, they would argue that those early centuries are kind of the flowering of apostolic tradition, and so it's not a falling away for them. Where for a lot of groups influenced by Protestantism, it is a negative view, right? So the apostolic pattern or the first century is held up, and then it's a deterioration, while Catholics and Orthodox wouldn't look at it that way. And so, on the one hand, you would have groups that would say, no, this is the development of church tradition as authority. Where the restorationists would say, no, what's happening is the interweaving of human developments with the pattern. And that you can see elements of the pattern, but you can see how that they're deteriorating. An example of this would be, it appears that there was plurality of leadership in congregations and churches across the Roman Empire, meaning that it wasn't one particular leader, it was a group of men. Now, there's a lot of questions about that. For example, in Rome, it appears that when Paul writes to the Church of Rome, he's writing to several house churches that he refers to as the Church of Rome. Was there plurality of leadership in a specific house church, or was there a plurality of leadership across the house churches? So, a group of individuals that was over the house churches of Rome. There's not clear evidence one way or the other, but it does appear to be that the leadership that existed in these cities, at the very least, was plural. There wasn't a one individual over that. And that carries into the later first century, after the writings of the New Testament, and even appears in the early second century as well. But what we see in the second century is also the development of a single leader over particular churches. Right? So you're moving to more of the single leadership as opposed to the plural leadership. And so the restorationist argument would be, well, this is moving away, that the pattern was plurality. Several men guiding a church. And so you're moving away to this single individual, which will eventually become the bishop model of Catholicism. Which, of course, takes a rather negative view of Catholicism. That it sits at the bottom of this deterioration. And so it's not, while in the Catholic mind, the Catholic view would be that what is today the Roman Catholic Church is a continuity of that apostolic church. Whereas the Protestant and the Restorationist view would be, well, those early Christians moved away from the apostolic pattern and gradually became Catholicism. Now, there's good historical reason to question the Catholic view that there's continuity there. There's good historical evidence, both from Protestant and Catholic scholars, that a lot of the things that are accepted as apostolic in Catholicism are not necessarily that they are developments. And so there have been Catholics at various time periods who have pointed out the differences between how the apostolic church functioned and how the Catholic Church eventually functioned. But you have rather a negative view of this, and so it kind of sits at the bottom of this historical slide. Evidencing things like the leadership of the Pope, right? So you have not only just this single leader over the different churches, it's eventually this single leader over the entirety of a religious group. The practice of infant baptism would be an argument that a lot of restorationists would make. Is that's another aspect of Catholicism that wasn't part of the original pattern. You don't have congregational autonomy anymore. The belief that the apostolic pattern was congregations were relatively autonomous, that they didn't have a hierarchical structure like what you have in Catholicism with its levels of leadership. And then, of course, the argument would be you see in Catholicism a development of leadership based on the hierarchy of the Roman Empire. So that as Christianity is accepted by the Roman Empire, it models things from the empire as opposed to necessarily holding to apostolic pattern. And in some cases, there's good historical evidence that would not necessarily be tainted or biased from a restorationist standpoint. So the idea that a lot of the hierarchy shaped by of Catholicism, early Catholicism, is shaped by the Roman Empire. I think a lot of historians would agree with that, whether they come from a restorationist mindset or not.